Thank you very much for this warm welcome. This is my very first trip to Brazil. I'm grateful for being invited by the Mises Institute Brazil, Mises Brazil, especially by Helio, and then the wonderful Kyokyo brothers. There are three of them who are taking part in this institute. So there's Cristiano. Finally, I've remembered the name because I called him all kinds of names: Francisco, Benedetto. So now it's Cristiano. That's very simple. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. We won't tell all the jokes that we told the past few days. Cristiano, Roberto, and Fernando. Fernando is the happiest among the three brothers because he's the full-time libertarian activist. He has the pleasure to actually spend his time promoting the cause of liberty in Brazil, which brings me to my subject, which is liberty, the social order, and neoliberalism. Well, this is a very weird title. I mean, the second weirdest title that I ever had for a talk. The weirdest one was something like liberty, feminism, and money. And and the only reason money was in the title because I didn't want to call it liberty, feminism, and sex, which would have attracted even more people. So we brought in neoliberalism because apparently there are widespread misconceptions, maybe not in this group, but in Brazilian society at large, that neoliberalism is about the worst thing that we can imagine on the right. And this is the true enemy that we have to face by these nasty people around the various Mises institutes that now exist in the world. So the point of the talk would be to give a little bit of enlightenment and to set the record straight where the true enemy is. Because for us, after all, neoliberalism is a better sort of social democracy. So now I would like to put this into context in my talk. I will first deal a little bit about, make one or two additions to what Professor Hoppe said in his talk about private law and public law societies, discussing a little bit the definition of liberty, then stress the emphasis that the kind of libertarianism that we stand for is Austro-libertarianism. So it's a political ideology informed by economic theory. And this is something that is relatively new in history and is unique in the present ideological landscape. And then finally, I will put this into historical context and try to show that Austro-liberalism, as we understand it today, is in a very long historical continuity and can be traced back to the Middle Ages. So the first thing I think that should be stressed about the theory of Austro-libertarianism is that it is a political ideology. That is, the ultimate point is to discuss the conditions under which we may use force and also to define what is liberty and what is force in the first place. This is something that has been stressed in Murray Rothbard's book, The Ethics of Liberty, and in case it's not yet been translated into Portuguese, I encourage you guys, in particular Leandro is the chief translator of the Mises Brazil, to do this. This is a wonderful book and very important book in which Murray Rothbard just in the very opening chapters stresses that this is the whole point of political philosophy, to define what liberty is and its opposite, namely power or force, and to define the conditions under which the legitimate use of force is possible. Now, so if we want to define liberty and its opposite, force, we end up with a definition that Professor Hoppe has given, namely a definition that centers around the concept of private property. Now this, as outspoken as he has done it, is relatively recent. It can be traced back to Frédéric Bastiat, so a French economist who in the middle of the 19th century was the first economist to put the concept of private property in the center of economic reasoning. This is the starting point of all political thought. So we have a definition of liberty that says human beings are free to the extent that they freely dispose of their own body and freely dispose of all the things that they acquire through their own body. So they are the first users or first transformers of things that they find in nature. It's not the definition of liberty that we find very often in textbooks and in discussions in the media, in the school, which says something like, I'm free to the extent that I can do whatever I wish. Freedom in the absence of any obstacles. Now, this is a very pure, real definition. It's probably the first one that one falls into spontaneously. And it's at best then modified to the extent in a social context when we define political liberty as saying, I'm free to do whatever I want as long as I grant the same liberty to other people. Now, that's a fairly vague definition. So first thing here to notice is liberty can never mean the absence of any obstacle. This, ladies and gentlemen, is a sort of liberty that at best God can have. Some of you might not believe in God, but I can tell you, even from a conceptual point of view, even if you don't believe in God, that's the only type of situation in which we can imagine a being that is completely free of any obstacles. It's only God that can do this. Human beings cannot do this. For example, in the very concept of choice, we are always, why do we have to choose? Well, because we have to choose. We cannot do two things at the same time. We would like to take part in this conference and also hang out at the beach, as Professor Klein has said this morning, and we were all feeling with him very strongly, right, that he had to give this lecture rather than hang out at the beach and look at wonderful Brazilian women. Also, here I sense a very interesting cultural feature. Okay, well, so human beings have to choose. So this is, for example, one thing that we cannot wish away, right? In the very situation of choice, we cannot choose not to choose. There's always something to which we have to renounce, which we cannot abrogate through any political arrangement, any arrangement of our own life. We always have to renounce to certain things. There are always obstacles that we confront. The same thing, of course, also in personal, moral behavior. Right? We can, of course, wish that there be no moral standards or something, but I think this is wishful thinking, right, which ends up in relativism and so on. The fact is that we cannot wish standards away, so there are, whatever our behavior is, we do endorse certain things, we do reject other things. So liberty then, as far as human beings is concerned, is always constrained liberty. If we define liberty correctly, and we have an ordered liberty, and in defining liberty in relation to the concept of private property, and we are not, as Professor Hoppe has underlined, we're not coming up with a solution or with a conception that is unheard of, but which can trace back right to the Old Testament and probably even to older sources to the extent that we find any of those. Right? In the Old Testament, you have the first 3 or 4 commandments that stress allegiance to God and so our rights and our duties as far as God is concerned, and the rest turns around private property rights. Thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not bear false witness, and so on, which are all property-relevant concepts. So political liberty then in the Austro-libertarian tradition, which reaches back far into the past, is the concept of ordered liberty. It's constrained liberty. And the resulting social order is then one ruled by natural law. It's a natural order. This is also something that Professor Hoppe has stressed. The particularity of Austro-libertarianism is that it goes into more detail analyzing the logical alternative to this constrained liberty, namely intervention through the force of government. So we can now define what force is, we can define what power is. Force or power relations are all those that involve the violation of property rights. Violations of property rights, be they be committed by ordinary criminals or be they committed by governments. And as far as the social consequences are concerned, there are a few differences. What Austrians, and before them, some of the classical economists have then stressed, their originality consists in analyzing the consequences of violations of property rights. And we can summarize these consequences under 2 or 3 headings. The first one would be all government interventions either hamper the exercise of natural liberty and therefore hamper natural productivity. And in hampering natural productivity, they impoverish society. This is the case when governments tax. This is the case when governments regulate the population, so they impose different behavior on them than they would have chosen spontaneously. Second, governments encourage irresponsible behavior. And in encouraging irresponsible behavior, they also inflict losses on society. This is very clear-cut in the present situation on the financial markets, right, which are in a deep crisis thanks to a very long-standing government intervention that has systematically de-responsibilized banks and other financial market participants. And we have central banks that have been created through government institutions, through laws, and the purpose of which was to stabilize the price level, or stabilize the banking system, and which, as a consequence, have encouraged irresponsible behavior on the side of banks and other financial participants. Right? Central banks bail out and refinance under particularly favorable conditions banks, and as a consequence, these banks have less incentives to protect themselves. So they hold less liquidity, they hold less equity, and they also have a greater incentive to engage in risky investments, which tend to provide greater returns. And as a consequence, then, we have the current mess on the financial markets. We have a very fragile financial industry all over the world, and which is therefore liable to be plagued by recurrent crisis, as we see in the present context. Again, so this is not the consequence of some recent policy error, but of a long-standing policy. It's the consequence of decades-long interventionism in financial and monetary affairs. Finally, governments impoverish us third. So the first thing would be by regulating and taxing the population. The second thing would be the encouragement of irresponsible behavior. And third, governments impoverish us by creating illusory security, or by creating illusions as far as the true nature of causal relations are concerned. So governments, precisely because their policies tend to impoverish the population, pursue also policies to cover up these facts. That's the reason, as Professor Hoppe, again, has underlined in various of his writings, that's the reasons why governments have for centuries sought to obtain a monopoly on public education and have obtained it. That's the reason why governments have tried to control the media, control the flow of information through the postal system in former times, then in the 20th century through control of the radio and TV stations. And one of the amazing things of the internet is that for the first time, probably ever in recorded human history, governments have not been able to control, or fully control at any rate, a major vehicle of information flows.